In my first life, I died famous. The cameras loved me when I smiled, the tabloids loved me when I bled, and the internet loved me most on the night I was ruined. It happened beneath crystal chandeliers at the centennial gala of St. Hesper Academy with 100 alumni in black tie and a live stream watched by half the city. My brother Gideon stood on the stage beside my fiancé, Arthur Vale, and called me what they had been calling me in private for years: cruel, spoiled, predatory, a girl who fed on weaker people and mistook money for character. Then they brought Ivy Lorne into the light, dressed in white, eyes shimmering with brave forgiveness, and the audience made the sound people make when they have found someone to worship. I still remember Ivy's hands folded over the microphone as if she were praying rather than lying. She said she had long ago forgiven me for humiliation, threats, vandalized costumes, anonymous rumors, and all the slow little cuts that made school unbearable for scholarship. Girls like her, she spoke softly, and that made the crowd lean in. Soft voices are dangerous. They force the world to come closer. And once the world is close enough, it will believe almost anything if the speaker cries at the right moment. I had never touched her. I had never needed to. She had built my guilt from air, then moved into it like a queen into a palace. When I tried to speak, the comments on the live stream exploded faster than my voice could. Travel, gold-digging heiress, violent elitist, fake artist. A reporter pushed a microphone to my mouth and asked whether it was true I had ruined other girls' careers out of jealousy. Another asked whether the scar on my wrist came from attacking someone at rehearsal. Then a woman in the crowd broke past security with a bottle hidden in her sleeve and flung acid at my face, screaming that monsters should not be allowed to breathe the same air as decent people. I never saw the stream after that. Pain turned the whole world white. Somewhere through it, I reached for the cake knife on the table and lunged toward Ivy, because if I was going to burn, I wanted the lie that burned me to burn too. Instead, I woke up in the girls' washroom in Building C-17 again, the day the trouble truly began. Ivy Lorne was standing beside the sinks in our winter uniform with a tap running hard over her hair. Water soaked her blouse and dripped from her lashes. She looked at me through the mirror with a smile that belonged on a saint in a church painting, if saints ever smirked before they screamed. Have you decided, she asked, how you're going to apologize? In my first life, I had frozen here. By the time I understood what she was doing, she had already stumbled into the hallway sobbing that I had cornered her. By afternoon, my name was poison. This time I crossed the space between us before the water even stopped splashing. I caught a fistful of her hair, dragged her to the nearest stall, shoved her over the sink basin, and turned the faucet full force. No, I told her. While she kicked and clawed, I have decided to teach you the difference between accusation and evidence. Her mouth opened under the stream in a strangled gasp. Mascara, cheap and half-dried, bowled down her cheeks. It was almost funny how quickly her angel act collapsed when someone gave her even half the roughness she loved to describe. I held her there just long enough for fear to bloom in her eyes, then let her go and stepped back with my hands lifted. There, I said. Now, when you cry about being bullied, at least one sentence will be true. By lunchtime, she had done exactly what I expected. She appeared outside the faculty office, trembling, drenched, and noble. Arthur found her first. Gideon found her second. I found them both staring at me as though I were a stain on expensive marble. Arthur was the picture of patient disappointment, tie straight, jaw tight, voice lowered for maximum dignity. Gideon looked colder, which was his natural state. But his anger had always been a chosen weapon, honed for me with more care than he gave anyone else. Ivy hid behind his shoulder, peeking out only enough for tears to glint. Even before anyone spoke, I knew the shape of the script. She would be fragile.
They would be righteous.
I would be asked to explain myself by people who had already decided not to hear the
Answer.
Arthur said my name the way a doctor might say. Terminal. Gideon asked whether I had finally grown tired of humiliating people in private and wanted an audience. I smiled because rebirth had burned away the instinct to beg. "We are done," I told Arthur. "Done with what?" he asked, startled for once into honesty. "With the engagement our parents drafted on paper and I mistook for affection." Then I turned to Gideon. "And if you're looking for someone to discipline, try the girl who keeps manufacturing scenes in washrooms. You will save the school a fortune in plumbing." Arthur stepped forward, hand lifting as if to catch my elbow, and I slapped him hard enough that half the corridor gasped. Gideon's eyes flared. Ivy's tears paused, even the vice principal blinked. It was a marvelous moment. For the first time in years, every person in that hall was forced off script. The school did what institutions always do. When truth and spectacle arrived together, it punished. Tone instead of motive. I received a warning for public aggression. Ivy received sympathy and chamomile tea. Arthur sent 3 messages asking whether I was under stress. Gideon came home that evening and informed me I had embarrassed the family. Mother looked worried in the tired way she always did, as though concern were a silk shawl she had learned to drape over discomfort. Father hardly looked up from his calls about port insurance and commodity futures. He only said, "No more incidents before the Centennial Gala." In another life I had spent entire nights crying because I could not understand why no one who shared my blood could
recognize my voice.
In this one, I simply noted the date, the room, and the fact that Father cared more about sponsors than daughters. St. Hesper Academy had one thing worth caring about that year: the Calder Fellowship, a fast track offer from the Conservatory Foundation, chaired by Maestro Elias Calder. One student from the academy would be selected after the Centennial Gala. In my first life, Ivy had won it with a porcelain pure piano solo and the halo of victimhood. I had been meant to perform a solo dance piece that night, but Arthur convinced me to withdraw, whispering that he wanted my beauty only for himself. I had thought possessiveness was romance. I know better now. Men often call it love when what they really mean is control with floral wrapping. So I registered early, not for a solo, but for a collaborative stage work with the girls from Class 12A, a fierce silk and drum piece, built from northern folk steps and modern percussion. If Ivy wanted the stage, she would have to share the sky. I also began doing what no one had expected of. The old Celine Ward, I kept records. Every conversation with Arthur, every message from Gideon, every time Ivy appeared conveniently injured, conveniently soaked, conveniently misunderstood. I bought a tiny recording chip from a gray market tech stall and stitched it into the lining of my watch strap. Mina Luo, my deskmate and the only person in school too blunt to be manipulated by trembling lower lashes, asked whether I was building a criminal case or starting a war. Both, I said. Mina considered that, then nodded as if I had finally taken up a sensible hobby. She was the daughter of a mechanic and believed that if something rattled for too long, you either tightened the bolts or took a hammer to it. He stood abruptly, and for one sharp second I saw the future in his face, the live stream, the accusation, the cool certainty that he was cleansing the family name by destroying me in public. "You will apologize to Ivy," he said.
I will do no such thing.
"Then do not complain about the consequences." I laughed. Consequences from you. I took 2 steps closer, close enough to see the small muscle jumping in his jaw. "You think I do not know you are paying half her tuition through that foundation account that you moved money under. The excuse of outreach because you like feeling noble when she looks grateful. If you want to rescue someone, choose a person who is not setting fires and then selling
Buckets.
He actually went pale. It was one of the sweetest things I had ever seen. Arthur's confrontation came by the lake behind the science hall, exactly where he had first kissed me at 16 and exactly where he had later learned to lie without looking guilty. He caught my wrist, not hard, just enough to suggest entitlement. "You are not acting like yourself." "I know," I said. "It is a relief." He studied me with that careful face of his, the one that persuaded adults he was mature and girls he was wounded. "If this is about Ivy, You're imagining rivalries that do not exist.
You're right, I said.
A rivalry requires that I care who she is to you. His hand tightened. You know nothing. That almost made me pity.
Him.
People like Arthur mistake secrecy for
Depth.
They think because they hide whatever they hide must be important. I know enough, I answered. Enough to know that a man who needs two women facing opposite directions so he can feel desired by both deserves neither. He kissed me then, or tried to, probably because, in our old life, I would have melted at any sign of possessive desperation. I turned my face and his mouth landed against my cheek. The disgust that moved through me was so immediate it felt physical, a cold line under the skin. I shoved him back. Do not touch me again. He actually looked wounded. After everything between us, there has never been an us, Arthur. There has been an arrangement, a habit, and your appetite for being admired by mutually exclusive
Audiences.
I stepped out of his reach. Keep your poetry for Ivy. Keep your ambition for my family. Keep your hands to yourself. He stared after me, as if I had just spoken in a language he had once known and forgotten.
Good.
Let him work for his confusion. I had paid for mine in flesh. Meanwhile, the gala preparations accelerated.
My
Team rehearsed until our calves shook and the blisters inside our silk shoes broke and reformed into harder skin. I poured money into costumes, lighting notes, and stage geometry. Because if war must be fought, then it ought to be fought with expensive symmetry. Ivy kept to the music rooms cultivating a martyr's solitude. Rumor said she practiced late under a single lamp, fingers bleeding onto the keys. Rumor neglected to mention that the school's finest piano technician had been booked for her by an anonymous sponsor whose initials matched my brother's. Rumor also neglected to mention that her rehearsal schedule mysteriously overlapped with mine often enough to cause repeated room conflicts. Once I walked into Hall 3 and found the dancers' prop trunks relocated to a stairwell in the rain. Ivy stepped out from behind the curtain looking startled in the way. Only practiced liars do. I did not know these were yours, she said, one palm resting against her throat. I just needed space to rehearse. The hall manager told me no. One was using it. I looked at the damp silk fans in the top crate and then at her dry shoes. Of course, I said. And the clouds rolled your boxes down the corridor as an act of musical devotion. Mina muttered something violent under her breath. Ivy turned to her with the gentleness of a nurse preparing morphine.
I
Know you both dislike me, but there is no need to be so mean. I only want one fair chance.
I
Smiled so brightly her pupils changed size. Then perhaps stop building those chances from other people's labor. She flinched, tiny but real. So she did understand. That was useful. It meant every tear afterward was a deliberate
investment.
A week before the gala, I visited the city. Rickard's office under the pretense of helping father with a charitable archive project. In truth, I wanted something else, background.
I
Dug through scholarship applications, sponsorship reports, and outreach case files until the shape of Ivy's life appeared in
Fragments.
She had transferred schools twice, once after a counselor reported peer conflict. Her guardianship documents were irregular.
the
Woman listed as her aunt had no legal custody. For 3 of the years, she claimed, there were old complaints from another district about missing instruments from a youth arts center that disappeared the same month Ivy was suddenly praised for resourcefulness under hardship. Nothing there was a conviction. Everything there was a pattern. I photographed it all. In my first life, I had died wondering how she always stayed one step ahead. In this life, I discovered she had simply been rehearsing long before our stage ever met hers. When the Centennial Gala finally arrived, the school transformed itself into a machine for glamour. Lanterns lined the avenue. A red carpet ran from the courtyard fountain to the grand hall. Alumni with money in their smiles mingled beneath banners stitched with the Academy crest. Mother fastened a necklace at my throat with fingers that shook ever so slightly. Try not to.
Provoke anyone tonight? She said.
Try to ask why anyone keeps trying to provoke me. I answered. She looked at my reflection in the mirror, and for a moment her face softened into something perilously close to guilt. Then the door opened. Father called for us, and the moment vanished like steam on glass. Downstairs, Gideon stood with the event Committee. Arthur wore black tie and moral. Fatigue. Ivy, in silver white, looked like moonlight filtered through calculation. The first sign that the trap was already moving came when one of my dancers burst into the dressing room, panting. The finale fans are missing. Not misplaced, missing. We searched everywhere. Then the assistant stage manager reported that my group's entrance had been shifted 20 minutes earlier because the piano segment needed technical flexibility. I left the others under Mina's command and ran to retrieve our backup drum ribbons from the movement studio across the East Bridge. The service corridor there was empty, too empty, and the lights on the stairwell landing buzzed like insects trapped in amber. At the top of the stairs, Arthur was waiting. He looked almost ill. You should not go on. Tonight, he said. Move. He did not. This is the only way. Those words reached me halfway. Breath before his hands did, he shoved my shoulder. Hard enough that my heel caught the stair edge and my body swung sideways into air. I remember the impact in pieces, ribs against stone, wrist scraping, concrete, the crack of my ankle against the railing, the stupidly beautiful sight of stage. Glitter scattering from the storage box like silver rain. For a split second, I lay stunned, hearing nothing except my own blood. Then Arthur was there above me on the landing, staring down, with the face of a man who had committed something irreversible and needed to call it love before it calcified into crime. You still have everything, he said hoarsely. One missed performance won't end you. Ivy does not have another road. The audacity of it almost restored my breath. Then she can learn, I whispered, to walk on her own ruined feet. He came down 2 steps, perhaps to help, perhaps to finish making sure I could not stand. I drove the metal corner of the ribbon case into his temple. He swore and staggered. I kicked upward with my good leg and sent him into the railing. Hard enough to split skin. Blood ran. Immediately, bright and shocked. You should
Have chosen a better staircase, I told him.
Through gritted teeth.
This one remembers
Gravity more faithfully than you remember. Promises. I left him there because my body already knew what my mind was still catching up. 2. The performance had begun. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a piano phrase floated through the ventilation shafts, soft and tragic and perfectly timed. Ivy was on stage. Of course she was on stage. She had wanted moonlight. I intended to bring weather. I limped into the grand hall through the side entrance like a creature dragged back from a battle no one had bothered to announce. Blood had soaked into the hem of my costume. My right ankle had swollen so quickly it seemed to have borrowed someone else's shape. On the stage, beneath a single white follow spot, Ivy sat at the Steinway in her silver dress with her hands moving over WC as though fragility itself had learned finger technique. The audience was under her spell. Mastro Calder sat 3 rows from the front, chin lifted, listening. In my first life, I had let the scene happen, watched from the margins and later paid for. That passivity with acid and applause. This time, I walked straight down the center aisle and climbed the stage while her left hand was still. Inside, a shimmer of arpeggios. The music broke when I kicked the bench leg. Sideways, Ivy hit the floor with a cry she almost managed to make elegant. The hall detonated into noise. Security moved.
teachers.
Shouted. Flashbulbs went off. I planted one hand on the piano lid to keep myself upright and, with the other, hit the emergency mic stand.
Switch.
My voice came out raw but clear.
Before
Anyone touches me, I said, ask why the girl in blood is interrupting the girl in silk.
that
Bought me 5 seconds. I used them well. Ask why Arthur Vale is bleeding on the east.
Stairwell.
Ask why my props disappeared. Ask why the scholarship saint on this stage keeps finding herself improved by other people's
accidents.
Ivy had gone still on the floor. No.
Longer weeping.
Good liars know when sound will. Heard the lie. Then I sat. The piano bench had twisted, so I righted it with my heel and lowered myself before the keys. Years in another life had left. Something useful in my hands? I began. Beethoven's Fifth, not the whole work, not a performance suitable for recital etiquette, but a brutal cut of it, enough to turn every head in the room and make conversation impossible.
The
Famous opening struck like an accusation hurled from the ribs of the earth. The hall fell into a shocked silence around it. I played through pain. I played through the hammering in my ankle. I played because if Ivy's talent was moonlight, then mine in that moment was architecture. It gave people somewhere to stand while truth rearranged the room. When the final chord crashed out, I looked straight at Maestro Calder and let the quiet after it do half my work. She said she wanted a fair competition, I told Ivy, my voice low enough that the microphone made everyone lean in. I'm here. Then I turned to the audience. I'm recording this statement
for legal purposes.
Arthur Vale pushed me down the east stairwell less than 7 minutes ago with the intention of preventing my performance. My watch recorded our conversation. I lifted my wrist, blood drying along the strap. In the same motion I pressed play. Arthur's voice, breathless and unmistakable, spilled through the speakers. She still has everything. One missed. Performance won't end her. Ivy does not have another road. The hall reacted, as if someone had lit fuse wire beneath every chair. Heads turned. Professors stood. Somewhere in the back, someone said, "My God, I was not finished." And since everyone is suddenly interested in roads, I said, perhaps we can examine the one Ivy Lorne built from self-injury, planted evidence, forged room, conflicts, and falsified hardship narratives. I nodded at the side screen. Mina, because I had chosen my allies better this time, was already there with the event tech lead who owed her Cussin a favor and me a miracle. The first slide came up. Topsnanks from Hall 3 showing Ivy accessing our locked prop room on nights she had claimed never to enter it. Then archives from her previous schools, then inventory discrepancies from the youth arts
Center.
Not convictions, but patterns.
Not
Enough to hang a legal verdict, but more than enough to poison sainthood. Ivy finally found her voice. You are insane, she whispered, though the mic loved her treachery and repeated it loudly. That was the end of elegance. Security reached me just as Gideon mounted the stage from the opposite wing. He looked not furious, but betrayed, which would have been laughable if I had breath to spare. Celine, he said, step away from the microphone. Or what? I asked.
You will save me. That landed.
He stopped, because for one instant the hall had become too honest for performance. People could see the brother, the fiancé, the scholarship girl, the blood, the recordings, the stagecraft. They could see there was no clean line left where he could still call himself righteous. I smiled, without warmth. You picked your martyr badly, I told him.
She
leaks under pressure. Then my ankle gave out completely and I hit the piano bench hard enough to blacken at the edges of vision. The last thing I saw before the dark took me was Ivy's face, not tearful, not meek, but furious, stripped at last of every ornamental softness she had cultivated. The hospital smelled the same in every life: antiseptic, stale flowers, and other people's interrupted plans. When I woke, my ankle was wrapped, my ribs bruised, and the news already everywhere. Not the whole truth, of course.
truth is expensive.
Clips are cheap. Half the internet was calling me unstable, theatrical, dangerous. The other half thought I was
Magnificent.
Several accounts dissected my Beethoven as if revolutionary intent could be proven by tempo. My pain medication made the whole thing seem faintly hilarious. Mother sat beside the bed with eyes swollen from crying. Father stood near the window, fielding calls from legal counsel and sponsors. Gideon did not come in until evening, and when he did, he shut the door with the finality of someone sealing a chamber. You have made a catastrophe, he said. No, I answered.
I interrupted one.
He stepped closer, every line in his body disciplined into cold. You humiliated our family. You humiliated yourself. Do you think public sympathy will save you, from whom my brother, my ex-fiancé, their pianist, his face barely moved, but something in him tightened. You always reduce everything to cruelty. Because with you, it saves time. He stood over my bed, and for a terrifying second, I saw not a brother but a man who had spent too long believing he was entitled to define reality for everyone around him. There will be consequences, he said.
I know.
I replied, that is why I prepared them. I slid my phone from under the blanket and showed him the outgoing email stamped 5 hours earlier. Full evidence packet forwarded to the school board, the conservatory committee, and our family auditors. I thought we were being transparent tonight. The school suspended both Arthur and Ivy pending investigation. because St. Hesper cared more about donors than justice. It called the whole thing an unfortunate conflict between students. Under pressure, Arthur's father hired 3 crisis consultants and a surgeon. Ivy's defenders went online to insist my evidence was cherry-picked and my injuries self-inflicted. Mother surprised us all by siding with me. Publicly at the board meeting, she did not do it. Dramatically, she simply placed my bruised rehearsal shoes on the table beside Arthur's recorded confession and said, "My daughter will not apologize for surviving a conspiracy." That sentence changed something in the room, perhaps in her too. Father, practical as always, took the hint and redirected his energy toward damage control. Through decisive action, he had Arthur's family removed from 3 joint ventures within the week. Ivy disappeared for 9 days, then resurfaced with an interview on a student media channel where she claimed the elite had destroyed her because she had dared to be talented while poor. In my first life, that story would have buried
Me?
This time it cracked on contact with 2 many facts. Former students from her previous schools came forward quietly at first, then louder. One girl described being accused of theft after refusing to lend Ivy sheet music. Another mentioned small self-inflicted injuries that somehow always appeared after disciplinary meetings. A volunteer arts tutor spoke about missing cash boxes. The narrative shifted, not enough to make Ivy powerless, but enough to make pity expensive.
That mattered.
Monsters grow best in environments where innocence is uninspected. Once people start asking for receipts, halos slip. You might think this would have made my home life easier. It did not. Gideon did not speak to me for weeks except through clipped logistical
Messages.
Father decided with the polished tyranny of powerful men who call decisions protection when they smell scandal that I should finish school abroad. Distance will cool the story, he said. And you always wanted the arts. No, I said. I wanted options. He looked genuinely confused. In his mind, my life had been written in satin years ago. Debutante, dancer, strategic marriage, philanthropy, tasteful interviews. The fact that I might want something uglier and more useful seemed to offend him. Then what do you want? He asked.
Finance, I said.
And port systems strategy. Silence. Mother stared. Gideon laughed once under his breath, unbelieving. I met his gaze and smiled. What? You thought only you were allowed to read numbers. So I left at 18 for Rotterdam, where the harbor smelled of steel, salt, diesel, and money. Moving in vast invisible currents, I traded silk, costumes for spreadsheets, ankle braces, and winter coats so severe they could have passed anti-corruption measures. I studied shipping, futures, logistics risk, port automation, maritime insurance, commodity mapping. In another life, I would not have chosen it. In this one, I understood the truth that had always sat behind my family's polished dinners. Ships moved, the blood of empires, and whoever understood the roots understood the body. I learned fast because anger is a phenomenal tutor when properly directed. I also learned because no one there cared who my brother adored. In secondary school, they cared whether my models held under stress, whether I could read a port strike 6 weeks ahead, whether I understood how weather events rippled into bond positions. It was in my second year that I met Elias North, founder of a maritime risk software firm everyone in class admired and feared. He came to lecture on predictive freight volatility, and I dismantled one assumption in his public model. During Q&A, instead of being annoyed, he invited me for coffee and spent 2 hours trying to decide whether I was insolent or useful. By the end, he hired me part-time. Elias was the sort of man who treated sentiment as a design flaw but loyalty as infrastructure. Under him, I learned how to price uncertainty, how to read the difference between a market panic and a market invitation, and how to bury ambition inside competence until people mistook the one for the other. He also taught me a sentence I kept forever: if you want revenge that survives your mood, build something
Profitable.
back home. The years arranged themselves into consequences exactly as I had predicted. Gideon used family influence to launch an arts tech venture heavy on image and light on governance. Arthur drifted between boutique funds and expensive failure, still handsome enough that people assumed discipline from the haircut. Alone, Ivy reinvented herself 3 times. Survivor, advocate, classical crossover, influencer, then education, entrepreneur. Every reinvention required money, and money requires patrons, and patrons always want stories cleaner than the hands that fund them through public records, private analysts, and the occasional old school gossip pipeline. Mina maintained with criminal devotion, I watched them all. I watched Ivy attach herself to Gideon's venture as director of youth outreach. I watched grant money leave through decorative channels. I watched Arthur return to her orbit publicly after denying it privately. For 2 years, I watched my father ignore the smell because the numbers still glittered on quarterly reports. I came home after 7 years, not as a daughter, in disgrace, but as managing partner of North Meridian Analytics, the firm Elias and I spun off after we cornered a niche in autonomous port.
Risk systems.
The tabloids called me elusive. The business press called me clinically effective, which was the sort of compliment I had once thought too cold to want. They were
Wrong.
cold things hold shape well. At the airport, mother cried when she saw me. Father shook my hand first and hugged me second.
Gideon.
Did neither. He came to the welcome dinner late, watched me across the table with the expression of a man who has just realized the map he has been reading for years was upside down. Ivy was not there, though her foundation's logo was on one of the place cards because my family had grown careless enough to confuse dinner with endorsement. That winter, the city prepared for the relaunch of the East Meridian Port, a colossal redevelopment project worth more than pride, but less than myth. My firm's algorithm sat at the center of the tendering debate. Father wanted me advising Ward Meridian shipping informally, quietly, as family. Gideon wanted access to my
Models.
Arthur wanted a private meeting to discuss alignment. Ivy wanted publicity.
She.
Called me first through an intermediary, then directly when I declined. 7 years. She said when I answered, "You always did know how to hold a grudge." I laughed softly.
No, Ivy.
"I know how to hold documents." She exhaled, through her nose, displeased at being denied.
Drama.
People change.
You're right, I said.
That is why I now invoice for the attention you used to get for free. She hung up, which I took as progress. I had the projector linked before Gideon found his breath. First came the shell company chart, then the duplicate grant flows, then the warehouse images, time-stamped, then Arthur's consulting approvals, then the donor money that paid Ivy's branded restorative music retreat. In Salzburg, complete with hotel receipts, mother went white. Father did something I had only seen him do twice in my life. He removed his glasses and cleaned them when they were not dirty, buying seconds because seconds were all he had left. Ivy tried wounded indignation. It would have worked on a weaker room. Unfortunately, the room contained auditors, lawyers, and me. "Be careful," she said, looking directly at father rather than me. "These materials can be arranged to look malicious."
Absolutely. I agreed.
Fortunately, I brought the originals and the warrants request templates. Arthur finally spoke then, but only to say my name in the tone people use when they have mistaken familiarity for leverage. Gideon made the same strategic error he always made with me. He chose authority over accuracy. "Enough," he snapped. "You have come back to dismantle your own family over old jealousy."
I.
Leaned back in my chair. "No, Gideon. Jealousy is what Ivy sold you because it was flattering. This is arithmetic." He slammed his palm on the
Table.
"You hated her from the moment she entered school." "True," I said. "She was dishonest, and I find repetition tiresome."
You.
"Ruined her life." I almost admired the conviction. "No." I interrupted her performance. Her life ruined itself because she insisted on monetizing fraud after the audience changed. Then I turned to father. "If you want to know whether I returned for revenge, the answer is no." Revenge is a short meal. This is governance. The lawyers on the far side of the table looked quite against their will. Impressed. By evening, the internal inquiry was formal. By morning, the press had the story from 3 angles and none of them flattering. Ivy tried to preempt the collapse with a live stream and a cream sweater framed by tasteful books and a tissue box placed with criminal precision within camera range. She announced that powerful people were retaliating against a woman who had devoted her life to helping girls no one else saw. I let her speak for 17 minutes. Then my team released the District 7 warehouse footage, the Salzburg invoices, and a clip from the old gala, the one where she stood on the St. Hesper stage forgiving me for sins she had built herself, split, screened against. Her current stream, the years between, exposed something stark and ugly. She had not matured. She had scaled. The internet is cruel, but it does possess one brutal virtue. It can smell. Recycled sainthood when given enough metadata. Arthur came to my office 2 days later pale, with the exhaustion of men who have finally discovered that polished neutrality is not the same as innocence. He asked to speak off record. I said no. He asked for 5 minutes anyway.
I
Gave him 4. I never meant for any of it to go this far, he said. He really believed that. Men like Arthur always imagine consequence as a river that somehow should stop exactly at the place where their own shoes begin.
Which part?
I asked. The staircase, the grants, the years you let a liar build a business on. Staged fragility because you liked being chosen. By her in private, while respectable in public. He flinched at the precision.
Good.
I was.
Young, he said weakly.
At 32, I said, your youth deserves a lawsuit. He looked at me, then with a species of desperate sincerity I would once have mistaken for love. There was a time you adored me. There was a time I answered. I thought weather and architecture were the same thing because both happened above.
Me?
He asked whether there was any path toward repair. Yes, I said. Hope moved through his face before reason could stop it. Confession. It died there, appropriately. Not to me. I continued. To the St. Hesper Board, to the Conservatory Foundation, and to the prosecutors. Reviewing misappropriation. Full cooperation. No. Poetry.
No justifications.
Names, dates, signatures, sequences. He stared as if I had asked for a kidney. That would destroy everything. Arthur, I said softly, everything was destroyed on a staircase years ago. We have been arguing only about the
Invoice.
He left without shaking my hand. 3 days later, his lawyer requested terms. People always discover honesty when bankruptcy begins to resemble biography. She came after me in the corridor.
Not.
Physically.
She had learned by then that evidence adored witnesses, but her voice changed. Gone was the dove's soft sadness.
What?
Remained was the rusted wire under it. Do you feel triumphant? She hissed. Do you think tearing me apart will give you back whatever your brother and Arthur took? I turned.
The
Corridor was empty, evening light folding through the high windows into long pale bars. No, I said, nothing gives back time. That is why I stopped bargaining for restitution and started pricing damage. She laughed then, suddenly and ugly.
You were always hateful.
And you? I said. We're always hungry. The difference is I eventually learned to cook my own meals. Her mouth tightened. For a second, I thought she might spit. Instead, she leaned closer.
You know.
The worst part, Gideon really did choose me.
Not.
Because I lied. Because when he looked at you, he saw himself being owed. And when he looked at me, he saw himself being needed. That one landed. Not fatally, but it landed. I did not sleep much that night. Some truths do. Not wound because they are new. They wound because they are finally articulated with ugly precision. Gideon had never loved me badly. He had loved himself strategically and mistaken. Authority for care. Understanding that freed me. In a way Fury never had. So when the criminal inquiry widened and his counsel asked whether I would support a deferred settlement to preserve the family name, I declined without drama. Let the names survive what the people have earned, I said. Mother cried when she heard. Father did. Not. He only nodded, tired all the way through, and signed the compliance authorization himself. That was the nearest either of us would come to. Reconciliation, not tenderness, but alignment. Under pressure, families like mine often confuse. Those two anyway. The final collapse took place in 2 rooms at once. In the first, a magistrate-approved asset freezes on the shell entities tied to Gideon and Ivy's foundation. In the second, our board voted on emergency restructuring for Ward Meridian. Shipping after the East Meridian port tender unexpectedly favored a consortium advised by North Meridian Analytics. Mine. Not through sabotage, through competence, timing, and years of work Gideon had never noticed because he assumed my rage was ornamental. When the vote ended, I became the youngest executive chair in the company's history. The press loved that part, naturally. Women returning to family empire's photograph. Well, they liked it even better when they learned I had redirected the arts philanthropy division into an independent trust administered by an external committee composed mostly of scholarship recipients and teachers who actually knew the price of bus fare. Redemption. Narratives sell, structural reform sells less. I chose the less photogenic option. Gideon resigned before the inquiry formally concluded. He sent me one message, 4 lines, long without apology. I read it once and deleted it. Arthur settled with the school and lost his advisory licenses for a period that his lawyer described as devastating and I considered educational. Ivy fought every proceeding. She could afford until she could no longer afford.
Them.
The memoir vanished. So did most of her admirers. Eventually, the public got bored, as it always does, and moved on to newer saints, and
Fresher ruins.
that, more than any verdict, felt like justice. Not because she was forgotten, because she was finely proportioned. She became what she should have been all along, not a legend, not a martyr, not even my opposite. Just a woman who mistook performance for invincibility and discovered too late that records outlive moods. There was one last visit I made before I allowed the city to become merely my workplace. Saint Hesper had renovated the east stairwell. New railings, new lights, no trace of the blood Arthur shed there or the bone-bright pain I carried down it. Memory is rude that way. Architecture recovers faster than bodies.
I
Stood on the landing and listened to the building breathe around me. A janitor passed, nodded, and kept going. Somewhere below, students laughed. Life insultingly continued. I put one hand on the railing and let myself imagine the girl I had been at 17. Furious, adored in shallow ways, starving in deeper ones, waiting for love from people whose primary skill was misreading devotion as obedience. You were never weak, I told the empty stairwell. You were simply outnumbered by lies. The words sounded small in the wide space, but true things often do. Maestro Calder invited me that spring to speak at a conservatory symposium on patronage, reputation, and gatekeeping in the arts. He admitted with admirable bluntness that he had almost chosen Ivy years earlier because suffering performed elegantly had appealed to his vanity as a rescuer. We all like to imagine we discovered genius in the rubble, he said. It flatters us. I gave the talk in a dark suit, with no jewelry except my watch, the recording, chip long removed, the habit of preparedness permanently installed. I spoke about institutions that reward narratives easier than labor, about the difference between supporting talent and purchasing dependency, about how often young women are forced to become symbols before anyone lets them remain human. When I finished, the applause was respectful rather than thunderous. I preferred it that way. Respect lasts longer. Once the cameras leave, 2 months later, Mina came to my office, carrying a carton of takeout dumplings and the sort of grin that means gossip has matured into architecture.
You will enjoy this, she said.
Arthur is engaged to a wellness investor from Singapore who believes in transparency retreats. Gideon is consulting for a battery startup in Iceland. They say the weather suits his personality. I laughed so hard I nearly lost a dumpling. And Ivy, Mina made a face halfway between pity and appetite. She is teaching private piano to rich children whose parents do not Google thoroughly. Give it time! We ate by the window over, shipping maps and weather feeds, and for the first time the names that had once structured my entire emotional climate sounded ordinary in the mouth. Not harmless, just ordinary. It is a blessing when former gods decay into anecdotes. Mother visited more often after that. Our relationship never became simple. She had looked away too many times for simplicity, but she tried, and effort, if sustained, can become a kind of bridge. One evening she asked whether I hated Gideon. I thought about it before answering.
No, I said at last.
Hatred implies intimacy. I do not grant him anymore. She nodded, as though the sentence cost her something. And Arthur? She asked. Arthur, I said, was a
Tutorial.
that finally made her laugh. It was a startled, almost guilty laugh, but real. We drank tea in silence afterward, both aware that some wounds do not heal cleanly, yet grateful they no longer bled when named. The true ending, if stories deserve one, came on a rain-heavy afternoon in early autumn. I had just signed the final papers establishing the Meridian Girls Transit Fund, a scholarship and housing network for students from unstable or manipulative sponsorship backgrounds.
Not.
Because I had become generous through suffering. That is another lie people love. I did it because I understood systems now. Hunger, talent, shame, dependence, access, none of these are moral abstractions when you have lived close enough to hear their joints creak. I stood on the balcony outside the conference room and watched cargo cranes move against a darkening sky. My assistant brought me the day's papers. On the business page was a photo of me beside the port redevelopment captioned with
Words like strategic, formidable,
transformative. None of them were wrong.
None of.
Them were the whole story. Sometimes the whole story is less glamorous. Sometimes it begins in a school washroom with a girl who smiles while soaking herself for effect. Sometimes it begins on a staircase with a shove and a choice. Sometimes it begins far, earlier in a house where love is distributed. Like favor and favor like a weapon. If I have learned at anything worth keeping, it is this. Survival is not the opposite of tenderness. It is the condition that makes honest tenderness possible. I did not become harder because hardness is beautiful. I became harder because softness without boundaries had almost killed.
Me?
There is art in that transformation too, though. No conservatory grants fellowships for it. Perhaps they should. The discipline required is
Extraordinary.
that night, after the office emptied and the harbor lights came on one by one like a second. City under the first, I went home alone. No.
Gala.
No cameras. No men offering to share my light while pocketing my shadow. Just the clean click of my apartment door, the hum of the heating, the soft thud of my bag on the hall.
Bench.
I poured myself a glass of red wine, stood barefoot at the window, and looked out over the water that had carried so many of my bargains away. Then I raised the glass to my reflection and smiled at the woman looking back.
You wanted a stage, I told her.
You built a harbor? It was not forgiveness. It was better. It was recognition, and for the first time in both my lives, that was enough.